Okay, in this second lecture we're going to have a look at the impacts of the changes in oil production, supply and demand. We're also going to have a think about patterns and trends, and there can be a pattern and a trend, and the difference between them can be a little bit difficult to understand. So just to remind you, a trend is a change over a period of time, and we've seen that there's an increase in the world's oil production over a period of time, both an increase in supply and an increase in demand. If you believe in peak oil, you will also understand that you will also think that there's going to be a decrease in oil supply. A pattern is not the same as a trend. A pattern is a geographical distribution. And one of the things that you would have noticed from the first lecture is that the growth in oil demand is shifting over towards our part of the world, that's China and the Asia Pacific area, due to economic growth. So moving on, there are these geopolitical and environmental impacts of increase in oil supply and demand. The environmental impacts will be a little bit easy to understand. The geopolitical ones we need to have to think about in more detail. So of course a classic one that you will look at for the environment is global warming. You know all about global warming and its theory and how the increase in oil consumption is in theory going to affect global warming. Personally, I don't believe that humans cause global warming, but that's for you to decide one way or the other. Let's still put it in. Again, the Gulf War. The Gulf War, cynics would say it's very much over oil and securing oil supplies. So there's videos for you to watch, and there's this argument that actually the increased demand for oil is causing political instability and wars. There's some other videos for you to watch. Let's have a talk about this one. The illegal washing of oil tankers at sea. Happens all the time. It's very easy when you're out in the remote sea for you to just wash out your oil tankers. This really is not so much, is of course related to the overall demand for oil, but also the pattern of consumption. The pattern of consumption is changing, and where you have your supply is not the same place where you have your demand, but also we're getting new areas that are increasing the demand for oil. So you have an awful lot more oil moving about. And in particular, you could argue that a lot of this oil is moving towards countries with poor environmental regulations. It's very much at the moment in the news, very relevant for those of us living in Hong Kong. There's this Japan and China conflict over the Spratly Islands. You'll call them by a different name depending on your political persuasion. But also for the Brits, you might have heard of the Falkland Islands. A lot of people are saying that the issue of sovereignty for the Falkland Islands is actually over oil, because there is a potential for there to be large oil supplies in the Falklands area. Classic one of the environmental impacts is Exxon Valdez. This is due to the transportation of oil. So the areas of supply are not geographically located to the areas of demand. So that means you've got to move oil around, and then also moving oil over longer distances to new areas of demand and consumption gets us into an Exxon Valdez situation and the oil spills. We've talked about Mad Max and those geopolitical issues, the doom and gloom scenario. We don't need to go over those again, but you might want to have a brief look at the Mad Max scenario. Okay, so we're going to have a look at this question. This is your favourite, which is an examining question. It's an AO3, considering an argument or concept in a way that uncovers the assumptions and interrelationships of the issues. Okay, let's break this down. The issues: supply will not meet demand in the future, and this will cause the price of oil to rise. There's another issue in there that I haven't got, that the pattern is changing, shifting over to different countries and maybe countries with weaker environmental legislation. You can add that one to your list as well. The concept is there'll be geopolitical and environmental consequences of the supply and demand mismatch. The assumption is that these will only be negative. This is just a suggested essay format. Remember, we want to think about in a both convergent and divergent way. We want to think in different ways, but narrow it down into some specific ways of thinking that we can focus on. Otherwise, we're going to talk about too much in not enough detail. So let's start off with the environmental impacts. You could say that this increase in supply and demand and that mismatch between supply and demand is bad. It forces us to find oil reserves in isolated hostile places and ecological sensitive areas. That's where we've got ourselves into the Alaska situation and the Exxon Valdez. Bad, we're forced to use lower grade oil that has a larger carbon footprint. An argument you could also bring in the idea of fracking, which is essentially getting oil, very low quality oil, out of the ground and turn it into a gas. Good things. There are some good things here, and you need to challenge the concept that it's all bad. Good. We have forcing us to develop and use and research and develop cleaner alternatives. Remember, the oil industry is only efficient as it is because it's had many years of research and development and investment and subsidies by governments. The question would be would alternative sources of energy and renewable energies be in the same situation if they had the same level of research and development funding and subsidy from the government? It also encourages resource consumption and substitution, and that helps to reduce the carbon emissions and the ecological footprints that we're imposing on the environment. Higher prices means governments could increase their tax revenue. So the governments are going to make more profit out of this, and then they can use those profits for a number of things, to have more stringent and strict environmental legislation to protect the environment. They could increase the price of the government permits to exploit the oil. But of course, this money can be spent in other ways. It can be spent for the social development of a country. A good example of that would be the United Arab Emirates, and particularly Dubai. If you look at what that country has done with their huge oil revenues, they've generated out of virtually nothing, quite literally sand in the desert, a very successful economy. Geopolitical. There are some bad potentials there. We've talked about the potential for war and conflict and destabilisation, the Mad Max scenario and the Gulf War situation, encouraging countries to go in and be very aggressive about the way they both use and secure their resources. We've already talked about the Spratly Islands, which is very relevant at the moment for Japan and China, Taiwan and the Philippines. It's also very bad for economy to rely on unstable prices that can suddenly increase or decrease. That's not a good situation to be in, and if you're tying yourself into one type of fuel, which a lot of countries are, you do really want to have a stable situation, both if you're selling it because you want to know what you're going to get, and also buying it because you want to know how much it's going to cost. A lot of governments are spending a lot of money subsidising fuel for their citizens to make it affordable to them and to help iron out changes in the market value. Moving on, there are some good things. The oil. The purchase of oil and rich countries purchasing the oil from poor countries does help to redistribute income. This is really going to help potentially for some countries with the Millennium Development Goals. Of course, it's not always that case. We come back to the case of the United Arab Emirates. You can see their massive redistribution of wealth, and they've made themselves a very successful economy. Contrast that to Nigeria, that the amount of oil there hasn't really helped the country to develop in a sustainable way for the benefits of its general population. Another good one is it could help us to resolve political conflicts, forcing countries to get on with each other. It's a negotiating chip that you are not going to go to a war to a country if they are supplying you with oil. So you could suggest that as well as causing political problems, it can help us to resolve our political circumstances, because you're not going to go to war with a country that is purchasing large amounts of oil from you, whatever's going to happen. So there we can see we're developing the idea of interrelationships. There's this link between the environmental impacts and the geopolitical consequences. They are linked to each other. Outline a few links in your essay. For example, the global redistribution of income, of money, because of the global oil industry can help to create geopolitical stability and decrease tensions between between different countries based on unfair income distribution, and that country can also use the money to achieve its Millennium Development Goals. So actually the issue of oil goes far, far beyond just the direct environmental and geopolitical impacts of it. Conclusion. This is where we just want to outline our main arguments, and you want to reinforce again the assumption. The popular assumption is that it's all bad. In fact, there are complex interactions, and if we do this properly, the increase in consumption of oil and the concept of peak oil could actually be a very good thing for many people on this planet and the environment.